Hello, 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 everybody. Uh, Dr. Harrold again. And here we are in MPA 665, which is leadership. So I'm really excited for this last 8 weeks, and I'll tell you why. The main reason is I really like the book by Northhouse. I've taught leadership at Bellevue and another university, and I've used the Northhouse book before. I've used several editions of it. And here's what I really like about this book. Look through that book, and what you will see at the end of every single chapter is a little assessment that you can take. We are going to use those assessments in some of your assignments and discussions, but for the times we don't use them, I would really strongly encourage you to take those yourself after you read the material in the chapters. The material in the chapters is very practical. The Northhouse approach is he refers to a lot of research in leadership, and there is a lot of research in leadership, but he really boils it down to some practical approaches. And those assessments will help you kind of apply those approaches to your own experience where you're at right now. So I'd really encourage you to do two things with this book. One is keep it because I think it's a really good book, and two, as we're going through this course, look at those assessments at the end of each chapter and use them as we go along. So this is another in my series of mini lectures that I've been doing for the last 8 weeks or so, and I want to continue that here. So, what do we really mean by leadership or leadership approach? So Northhouse says in the book, and by the way, we might have a couple of different editions here. This is from the 6th edition. If you have the 7th edition, that's fine. But the definition is the same. Leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So really, leadership is a process. And so the approach of leadership is simply how this influence process is achieved. I mean, if I'm a leader and I am successful at influencing a group of individuals to achieve this common goal that we all have, what is my approach? And then there are different approaches to leadership, and that's what we're going to be talking about as we go through this 8 weeks with Northhouse. So here's some of the approaches. I'm not going to dwell on these next two slides very much because we're going to move into the trait approach. But really, there's different ways of looking at leadership. And if you look at this table, you'll see what we're talking about. One is what's called the trait approach right here, which means it's centered on the leader and the focus is on that leader's inherent personality. Each of these approaches has strengths and criticisms, and what I'd like you to do on this slide is take the time to look at these strengths and criticisms. I'm not going to go over them in this mini lecture, but please do look at them as you go along here. So there's the trait approach to leadership, meaning we're looking at leaders and we're trying to decipher what kind of traits that leader has in her or his personality. And then there's the skills approach. So what is the focus of the skills approach? Again, the focus of the skills approach is the leader, but instead of the leader's personality, we are looking at learned skills of the leader. So what are the skills we can see that a leader has? And then we move on, and we'll do this later, to the styles approach. Again, the focus is on the leader, but instead of looking at some kind of inherent personality traits or skills that can be learned, we're looking at behavior. So in other words, no matter what I know or no matter what kind of person I am, I can exhibit certain kinds of behavior, right? I mean, it might be more difficult to exhibit some kinds of behavior than others, but the point is that this approach says that behavior brings about outcomes. And then there's the situational approach. And this is interesting because it really focuses on the follower. Now, people say situational leadership focuses on the leader. It's actually just the opposite. It's actually a leader analyzing the situation that the followers are in and then modifying their behavior appropriately in an attempt to motivate the followers. So Situational leadership is actually a way of trying to figure out where the followers are at and then adapting my leadership behavior appropriately. So those are basically 4 approaches to leadership. But so this week in the reading, your reading is gonna talk about this idea of the trait approach. So what do we mean by the trait approach? The next 2 slides, I want to go over this idea of great person theories, historical shifts in the trait perspective, what traits differentiate leaders from non-leaders, and how does the trait approach work? So the trait approach really was one of the very first, as Northouse says, one of the very first systematic attempts to study leadership. And in the early 1900s, and really before that, if you read some ancient literature, I don't know, like even the book of Proverbs, it talks about what holy men do, what great men do, right? So the great man theory of leadership says, hey, what is it about these great leaders that we have known that made them great leaders? So what was it about George Washington that made him a great leader? What was it about Abraham Lincoln that made him a great leader? What was it about, you name it, Jesus Christ that made him a great leader? What was it about any person you can pick out of history and made this person a great leader? Well, you can kind of see that there's a flaw in this, and that is that, first of all, we're identifying people as great, and then that limits our field. We don't really know anything about the leadership of ordinary people in ordinary situations. We only know about what the great men do and what were their traits. And so this chart, and you can find this in Northouse too, in the reading, what it really is trying to tell you, and I won't dwell on this, is how the trait perspective has evolved. And the trait perspective still is used, but we evolved from these great man theories where research was focused on individual characteristics and that, universally differentiated leaders from non-leaders. So we said that no matter what kind of situation these great men were in, and it was typically, it focused on men in the early 1900s. Very few women were focused on. But what these people tried to find were universal characteristics that all of these men had. But that then evolved to more sophisticated studies where people looked at traits interacting with the situational demands on leaders. And so, there were actual scientific studies that synthesized more traits and in different situations, right? And then further research moved from less emphasis on situations and more emphasis on how traits could discriminate leaders from non-leaders. And then, we move on to research that looks at traits in leader effectiveness. I mean, are there traits that make certain people effective and other people ineffective? I mean, you can even read this in a lot of literature. Stephen Covey talked about the 7 or 8 characteristics of great, I guess he said great leaders. I can't even remember to tell you the truth. You remember there was a book written by Tom Wolfe and later became a movie about the first 7 astronauts in the U.S. space program. It was called The Right Stuff. And that word, the right stuff, actually has some meaning in leadership characteristics, right? You're looking for people with the right stuff. And that's what the early Mercury astronaut program was about in the United States. They were looking for people with the right stuff to launch this, previously unheard of space program in an effort to land a man on the moon. And then today, what we've evolved to in this leadership trait study is traits that leaders do share, and not just great men per se, but others. So intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. And these really are, you would look at these and say, these are really personality traits, right? Um, these are things that you can find typically in leaders in a variety of situations. Let me go back. Intelligence is this verbal, perceptual, and reasoning capabilities, right? You have intelligence and you use it. Self-confidence, which we know can quickly lead to excessive self-confidence or arrogance if a person's not careful, but certainty about one's competency and skills. Determination, the desire to get the job done, which we would call persistence. Um, Integrity, so qualities of honesty and trustworthiness and sociability. That is the leader's inclination to seek out uh, social relationships. So, we actually, if you think about these traits, it is true. I think you can say that we do end up judging people who are in the public spotlight by one or more of these characteristics, don't we? And so we say that person's not a very good leader because they're dishonest. They have no integrity, for example. Or this person can't be a very good leader because he's just not very intelligent. And so we end up doing this, right? As humans, we end up doing this to other humans if we're thinking about their leadership traits. And so here's the thing about the trait approach, and this is a plus and a minus. The trait approach focuses exclusively on the leader, right? What traits does the leader exhibit and who has these traits? Well, what about the followers? Do the followers influence the leader? And we get to that later on in the book, right, where we're talking about situational approach to leadership. What the trait approach would say is anybody with these leadership traits could lead in any situation. Now, you can decide for yourself if you think that's really accurate or not. I will just utter my personal opinion and tell you that I don't believe people are born leaders. I think people have to learn skills on leadership just like they learn other skills. So I'm giving myself away a little bit here on my approach to leadership, um, but you do have to focus on leaders in some situations. And so if you were using the trait approach and if you were hiring a leader, for example, you might use a personality assessment to find the right people. And indeed, I think that some organizations, when they hire people, this is exactly what they're doing. They are using a battery of tests to find people with specific characteristics and traits to fit into certain places in the organization. You've heard of the Myers-Briggs, for example, at the bottom of this page here. Lots of organizations use the Myers-Briggs in hiring, even though that's controversial, and a lot of people say you really shouldn't hire based on the Myers-Briggs. A lot of organizations do it. And so another aspect is something that goes back to the famous psychologist Carl Jung, who came up with what he called the big 5 traits of personality: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These are really standard fare for psychologists to use in personality, and we still use these today. And organizations, I think, will continue to use these, right? So openness. If we say that openness is a desirable personality trait, you can see an example of behavior for a low scorer, which is a person prefers not to be exposed to alternative moral systems, has narrow interests, is inartistic, not analytical, where a high scorer might enjoy seeing people with new types of haircuts and body piercings. So we're talking about a person who's open-minded, right? And you can see these low scorers and high scorers on tests where they test people for these 5-factor personality traits. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. You might want to just pause the video here and look at these characteristics that are listed on this table, because they're pretty good and they're pretty interesting. Okay, so your assignment actually for this week is assessing yourself. And what we ask you to do in the assignment is look at a couple things. One is just kind of assess yourself using these 5 factors of the Jungian um, personality model. Assess yourself where you think you are, and then assess yourself looking at what is called your emotional intelligence. What we say in the assignment is to find one online, and you can certainly do that. I mean, I looked online and found scores of emotional intelligence tests. I gave you a link for one that I think is pretty useful, but you don't have to use that one. And then the third thing is this leadership trait questionnaire, which is found in your reading, I think at the end of chapter 2. So complete that questionnaire and then assess yourself on that. And then once you do all 3 of those things, go ahead and write your 500-page paper and post it on the discussion board. And the rationale behind this is to really assess yourself where you're at as a leader, and then we'll move on from there during the next 8 weeks. So that is it for this mini lecture. I hope you enjoy reading the first couple chapters of North House. Again, it's a great book, and it's a very practical book, so I think you'll enjoy this 8 weeks. Thanks.